that statement to pass
would
out
you
to
remove
my
Mr.
colleagues.
Green from the chambers? Would you remove Mr. Green from the chambers, please?
What was the meaning of this disruption of last December 13th's D.C. City Council meeting? And what could have caused such anger? Hello, I am Lorri Jean for the Gay and Lesbian Activists Alliance of Washington. Today, we will be discussing home rule and accountability from a gay and lesbian perspective. With me to discuss these issues are three members of the local lesbian and gay community: Jim Harvey, Deputy Administrator of the Whitman-Walker Clinic; Jeff Levy, Executive Director of the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force; and Barrett Brick, Executive Director of the World Congress of Gay and Lesbian Jewish Organizations. Last December 13th, the D.C. City Council took some actions which affect our welfare and rights in this city. But before we discuss those events, Jeff, could you give us some background?
Lorri, 15 years ago, the D.C. City Council passed the Human Rights Act. It became law, and it prohibited discrimination based on sexual orientation, along with 14 other categories, including race, gender, religion, and physical handicap. This applied to everyone, including educational institutions.
Yet in 1980, Georgetown University blatantly discriminated against its gay and lesbian students by refusing to provide them with equal facilities. The students sued the university, claiming a violation of the D.C. Human Rights Act. I was one of those students attending Georgetown University Law School at the time.
Well, Lorri, it took 8 years in court, but the students finally won. The D.C. Court of Appeals ruled that the Georgetown had to provide the same services for the gay student groups as they did for every other group, even though it didn't have to officially recognize those groups. Last October, however, just a few minutes on Capitol Hill were enough to take away what we had struggled for almost a decade to obtain. Despite assurances from Georgetown that it was happy with the lawsuit and how it turned out, right-wing champion William Armstrong went to the Congress and took the D.C. Appropriations Bill hostage. Armstrong succeeded in stampeding the Congress into ordering the D.C. City Council to permit any educational institution that was affiliated with a religious organization to be exempt from the D.C. human rights restriction on discrimination based on sexual orientation, and that included Georgetown. As you know, we don't have complete home rule in the District of Columbia, and Congress must approve our City Council passed budget. And each year, the new right uses that appropriations bill as a vehicle to, in a sense, do litmus tests on members of Congress on a whole range of issues like abortion. And this year, what we saw happen was the addition of gay and lesbian rights and discrimination based on sexual orientation added to that litany of issues that the Congress tries to impose on the District of Columbia.
Well, let me read you some of the language that Congress ordered the D.C. Council to adopt. It shall not be unlawful in the District of Columbia for any religious-affiliated educational institution to deny any fund, service, facility, or benefit to any person or persons that are organized for or engaged in promoting, encouraging, or condoning any homosexual act, lifestyle, orientation, or belief. If our council members who opposed this sweeping discriminatory language had failed to vote for the act, they would have not been allowed to spend any of the money to run the city, not even D.C.'s own tax dollars. In November, all 13 of the D.C. City Council members sued the United States. Mayor Barry did not join the suit. On December 13th, the council won its first round, when District Court Judge Royce Lamberth, who was a Reagan appointee from the Department of Justice, found that the Armstrong Amendment was unconstitutional. Defending the First Amendment rights of the council members, Judge Lamberth wrote, "Congress chose to create a legislative body, not an administrative one. Without protection to vote as they wish, legislators would be unable to consummate their duty to their constituents." Attorneys for the Department of Justice have appealed this decision, and in their brief, they are silent about Judge Lamberth's decision that the council is a legislature. They simply resort to asserting that the council is nothing more than a ministerial body which has to do Congress's bidding. They ignore the fact that our council members are responsible to the voters who elected them. This is an offense to every citizen in the district. Now, while the council members were victorious in their suit, they lost their resolve in several other ways. Jim, could you elaborate on that?
Well, last December, for example, what happened in the council was they had refused to add language to John Ray's insurance bill that would adequately protect us from redlining practices that insurance companies had been known for. They granted Georgetown University tax-exempt bonding authority without requiring Georgetown to waive its right to use the Armstrong Amendment to try to vacate the court order in the suit that had been settled in our favor last year. Judge Lambert's decision not only let them off the hook at the last minute, but the council was expected to pass emergency legislation approving the Armstrong Amendment. Members of our community saw this happening, and they decided to take action.
Barrett, you're a member of OUT, Oppression Under Target. Tell us about the D.C. Tea Party that was organized last December and your protest at the December council meeting. In fact, we saw you on the screen a few moments ago in prison stripes.
Being dragged and thrown out, yes. Well, the two events, the D.C. Tea Party and the protest in the council chambers, were related. OUT, taking the lead in this, along with many other community groups, approached this from a sense of history and its immediacy to us today. 200 years ago or so, there was the Boston Tea Party in Boston when American colonists, tired of being subject to the whims of a tyrannical monarchy and legislative power overseas, started to take action into their own hands when they realized that sweet reason and calm protests and letters just weren't being listened to. We saw this happening again here in D.C. when, with what's called home rule, but in reality we are still subject to the whims of Congress, which, as Jeff and Jim have indicated, has been behaving with more and more tyranny in recent months towards members of our community and our community at large, organized what we call the D.C. Tea Party, taking a lead from the Boston Tea Party. And for weeks leading up to the December council meeting, which was to be the last council meeting of the year, when they had indicated and everyone expected they would take action to comply with Congress's will, we had collected protest letters and protest messages attached to tea bags that we brought into the council chambers, and in a somewhat perhaps flamboyant but definitely direct manner, so they would know that we were there and that their constituents were not going to take being ignored for an answer. We presented them with the tea bags. Some of us got dressed up in what were called prison stripes. Actually, they were a reminder based on concentration camp uniforms, throwing pink triangles, the symbol of the gays and lesbians that they were forced to wear in the concentration camps, to remind the council people that not only will we not take in being ignored for an answer, but we will not accept the answer of, there's nothing we can do, we're only following orders. We've heard that before, and that's just simply morally obscene and unacceptable.
Before the decision finding the Armstrong Amendment unconstitutional, the local lesbian and gay community had placed a lot of pressure on members of the city council, urging them to refuse to amend the D.C. Human Rights Act. At that time, many of the city council members said to us, look, we're not your enemies, you should be going after Congress. How do you respond to that?
Well, if they think we haven't been going after Congress, if they think they were not going after Congress, they obviously don't know the work that Jeff Levy and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force have been doing, that most of us here in D.C. have been doing. That's just a disingenuous response on their part. And it also ignores the basic problem that we are facing, that they were facing. We don't have voting representation in Congress. We're not the state of Columbia, we're essentially the colony of the District of Columbia, subject to the will of Congress. There was no one in Congress we could go directly to and say, you're our representatives, listen to us. It's the council, the members of the council and our mayor that are our elected representatives and that we expect to represent us, and not just to turn tail and run and abandon us when the going just gets a little bit tough. A wise person once said that all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. And last December 13th, 13 ostensibly good people did nothing, and the mayor did nothing.
Also last fall, some of the council members began pitting the civil rights of lesbians and gay men in the district against the rights of other residents. In fact, Ward 1 Councilman Frank Smith said, I wouldn't want to be gay in this town if the Congress closes down the city because of them. Barrett, you live in Ward 1, as you just said. What do you think Smith was up to when he made this statement?
Well, disappointing a lot of his constituents, if not most of his constituents. Quite frankly, he was scapegoating. you don't really perform your duties as a legislator properly if, instead of standing up to the real problem, you try to solve it by panaceas, by pitting group against group, neighborhood against neighborhood. But we shouldn't just single out Councilmember Smith, although he is my councilman. It was from the top down. The mayor said similar things, Council Chairman Clarke said similar things, and quite frankly, it's also not just on this one issue. We've seen this problem with violence in the city. When people are being beat up, robbed, and raped in parks, their solution is get people out of the parks, close the parks. When people are being shot up in drug wars on the streets of our city, their solution is put through a curfew, throw the people off the street. There's got to be more from our government than just telling us to stay home and lock our doors when there's a problem.
Jeff, the current struggle for home rule here in the district has become a watershed for gay and lesbian civil rights. What are the stakes here?
Well, I think the stakes are both national and local. I think certainly what the Congress has been doing has been sending an implicit message to gays and lesbians around the country as to just how readily they are willing to fold under the pressure from the new right to offer them a litmus test. But I think the stakes are much, much greater at the local level. This is one of the most direct challenges to home rule and to the integrity of home rule. But it's also a challenge to the leadership of our elected officials. The gay and lesbian community has been such an important part of the political culture in the District of Columbia. The support of the City Council for our rights has been unquestioned over the last 10 or 15 years, as long as there's been home rule. Now that's being called into question, and we're going to see just how deep that support is and how much a part the gay and lesbian community is of the true civil rights traditions of the District of Columbia, and we don't know the answer to that yet.
Well, maybe it'll be a moot question. I was thrilled to learn recently that Senator Armstrong is retiring. Do you think that this will put an end to our battles with Congress and stop the assaults on home rule and gay and lesbian rights in our district?
Unfortunately, William Armstrong is not the only new right congressman or senator. Jesse Helms will still be there, and others will also be there to carry on, I think, those tests and those challenges.
You know, because the D.C. Human Rights Act is nationally recognized as model legislation, I find that a lot of people are very surprised to learn that the district still has a sodomy law in the books. Does that law really affect anyone?
It certainly does. There are 25 states in the District of Columbia that still have sodomy laws. Most of them apply to heterosexuals as well as homosexuals. They are certainly rarely enforced. Certainly in the District of Columbia, it's very rare to see a prosecution strictly on the sodomy law. In other states, it does happen more often, and it actually tends to be done selectively as a vehicle for persecuting or going after gay people in particular. But there are other vehicles that affect our lives, even though those sodomy laws aren't enforced. Their being on the books makes a tremendous difference. It's a struggle to get police departments. The District of Columbia is, again, an exception to hire gay police officers because it is alleged that if we are violating the sodomy laws, how can we be in law enforcement officials? It's used in custody cases where a non-gay parent will challenge the custody rights of a gay parent, claiming that this person is an unconvicted felon, and so on down the line. So the impact of these laws stretches well beyond the literal interpretation or the literal enforcement of that law to create an environment that is really hostile to gay men and lesbians.
Well, now, in 1981, the D.C. City Council did try to amend our sodomy laws, which apply to both heterosexuals and homosexuals, married or single, and tried to take them off the books. And in fact, the entire City Council voted to repeal that law. Unfortunately, in a battle on the Hill led by Congressman Philip Crane, that attempt was vetoed, and with a lot of help from Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. And our battle to repeal sodomy has continued. Councilman Dave Clarke has introduced a revised bill called the Rape Protections Act, which legalizes private sexual acts between consenting adults and also strengthens and consolidates our sexual assault laws. Yet, for some reason, Councilmember Wilhelmina Rolark, who is the chair of the Judiciary Committee, refuses to act on this bill. And in the past 2 council sessions, it has died in her committee without hearings, without any word. Jeff, what can we do if Ms. Rolark keeps refusing to let this bill out of committee and holding it up?
Well, I'm not sure that we ourselves are going to be able to move Mrs. Rolark. She's certainly been resistant on this issue. But I think other council members can move her. Her colleagues can persuade her. And I think for certainly the gay and lesbian community and for all of us who care about privacy rights, and that certainly goes well beyond gays and lesbians in the city because the sodomy law applies to all people in the city. Those of us who care about our privacy rights need to be putting pressure on our council members and saying the condition for our support of you for re-election or for new people challenging incumbents or running for open seats, our condition for supporting you is that your defense of privacy rights be unwavering and that you put pressure on Mrs. Roehr to see this bill discharged from committee. I think it can be done if, we had unanimous support for the sodomy repeal law the last time around. There's no reason why we couldn't get a similar vote this time around if Mrs. Roehr would just let it come to the floor and let it be voted on and let us deal with the Congress head on if they try to once again interfere with home rule.
How does the Hardwick decision, which was the recent Supreme Court decision which permitted a sodomy law, apply to all of this?
Well, one of the hopes that the gay and lesbian community certainly had was that the Supreme Court would strike down sodomy laws around the country as unconstitutional, as an invasion of our fundamental constitutional right to privacy. Well, in 1986, in a 5-4 decision ruling on a Georgia sodomy law, the Supreme Court essentially said this doesn't apply to gays and lesbians. The constitutional right to privacy doesn't apply to gay men and lesbians. It said essentially that the state of Georgia and any other state had the right to arrest anyone for committing sodomy in the privacy of their own bedroom. Now, there were some eloquent dissents, and sometimes eloquent dissents become the majority opinion years later, and that's certainly something that we hope for. Justice Harry Blackman criticized the court majority for ruling according to personal prejudice. To quote Justice Blackman, "Depriving individuals of the right to choose for themselves how to conduct their intimate relationships poses a far greater threat to the values most deeply rooted in our nation's history than tolerance or our nation's history than tolerance of nonconformity could ever do. A necessary corollary of giving individuals freedom to choose how to conduct their lives is acceptance of the fact that different individuals will make different choices." Another member of the minority, Justice Thurgood Marshall, has called Hardwick the worst Supreme Court decision of recent times. Gays and straights alike have condemned this decision as running counter to the American tradition of protecting the right to privacy, a tradition that goes back to the days of Jefferson.
Barrett, you're a member of Washington's Gay and Lesbian Synagogue, Beit Mishpachah. What role do gay and lesbian ministries have in combating religious-based intolerance?
Well, there seems to be thrust upon us a major role of that, and it's not just Beit Mishpachah locally or the organization internationally that it's a member of, which I head, the World Congress of Gay and Lesbian Jewish Organizations, but dignity within the Catholic Church, integrity for Episcopalians, affirmation, Presbyterians for Lesbians and Gay Concerned, all the religious groups, whether they're independent gay and lesbian or religious groups or groups of gays and lesbians and their friends within the denominations, are consistently working to educate both our denominations and through them the world at large that religion is not meant to bring hatred and divisiveness and disparagement into the world, but there is a message in our faith of love, tolerance, and even acceptance. And I think here in America we're particularly blessed, if I may use the word, that we have a Constitution and a Bill of Rights that guarantees this. The founders of this nation realized the danger of state-imposed religion and state-imposed conformity. And the First Amendment protects our right to worship as we please and to live our lives without interference from others based on their intolerance or narrow-mindedness. Quite frankly, to utilize the First Amendment, as many have tried to do, as a shield for religious bigotry, perverts its meaning. It turns it on its head. And again, to quote Justice Blackman, as Jeff Levy did, that certain, but by no means all, religious groups condemn the behavior at issue gives the state no license to impose their judgments on the entire citizenry. A state can no more punish private behavior because of religious intolerance than it can punish such behavior because of racial animus.
Well, just as we in the district have not escaped the assaults of Congress or the Reagan majority on the Supreme Court, we have not escaped the AIDS crisis. Last October, the Names Project Quilt was displayed on the ellipse, bearing the names of thousands of people who have died from AIDS over the past years. And the quilt demonstrates how the AIDS crisis has affected those of us who are living. In December, the D.C. Council voted to allow insurance companies to test applicants for AIDS antibodies. Health insurance is increasingly unavailable to people who are testing positive or who have AIDS. Jim, the Commission on Public Health has projected that there will be 1,000 new cases of AIDS in the district this year, with 1,700 people in the city living with AIDS. What's being done to help people who are infected and can't get health insurance?
Well, one thing that we know is that Councilmember John Wilson has proposed a health insurance bill for the District of Columbia, because health insurance is a problem that many people in the District of Columbia continue to go without for any number of reasons. They just can't afford it. A lot of small businesses can't afford to offer them health insurance, and the cost of premiums makes it prohibitive for people. Included in that would be the availability of this health insurance to people with AIDS, and they would not be subjected, hopefully, to the testing that many insurance companies may decide to resort to. In addition to that, the Commission has proposed the expanding of important programs like the AZT Program, the Pentamidine Program, and making these programs available, these services available to people living with AIDS, either at a seriously reduced cost or at no cost at all. And of course, you know, the longer you live with the illness, you can't work, you know, you have little or no income. We find that better than 50% of the people, for example, at Whitman-Walker Clinic that are clients of ours are living on incomes of below $500. That means then that they are below the poverty level, and the high cost of medical help, the high cost of prescription drugs continues to skyrocket, and something's got to be done. So the Commission is trying to do everything that it possibly can. It's also expanding the use of federal funds, making them available to the fortunately growing number of community-based organizations that are interested in becoming service delivery organizations in the city. And they're even, because of the budget constraints, making available some of their personnel, this is in the Commission, mind you, making their personnel available to assist community-based organizations in responding to and applying for a lot of these funds. So I think that there's some very creative kinds of things happening there, and we just have to wait and see.
Obviously, there's a serious gap in AIDS funding that's got to be filled somehow. We've just come through a budget battle with the D.C. City Council and the mayor, fighting to get the money that's allocated for AIDS increased to reflect the needs of the actual amount of cases, but Mayor Barry, neither he nor the council appear to intend to spend the much-needed money that's already been allocated for AIDS this year. How can the mayor be convinced and the council be convinced to spend this money and increase the budget for the next fiscal years?
Well, one of the things that's happened is, as a result of the testimony of organizations like the Metropolitan Committee on AIDS Issues and Whitman-Walker Clinic and the African American Collective on AIDS Issues, and many other organizations for that matter, before the council, before H.R. Crawford's Committee on Human Services during the budget hearings, one of the things we pushed for was more aggressive and close-quartered oversight of budget spending. And that's something that we're really out to see happen. And Chairman Clarke recently said he was introducing a bill on oversight so that committees could, in fact, exercise more power. You know, one of the problems is that the council can appropriate a large sum of money for AIDS, and the mayor can turn around to his budget office and reappropriate that money for anything that he wants by throwing it into the general fund or reassigning it anywhere, anytime during the fiscal year. That has to stop, because one of the things that we find is every year it's the same battle. You said we had X number of thousands of dollars available, and now you're saying we don't have that and this program has to be reduced. That has to stop, and the only way it's going to stop is if the council will aggressively and diligently exercise its authority and oversee the expenditure of appropriated dollars.
Well, apparently the majority of the council doesn't agree with you, although I do. You mentioned a bill that Councilman Clarke introduced. That bill was defeated. It would have given the council the power to oversee those funds. What now?
A lot of the committee heads, particularly H.R. Crawford, has said that he's going to go ahead and do it anyway. And I think that all we can do as a community is to lobby each of those committees and see to it that they know that we're watching them very carefully. We encourage it and we stand behind them in their efforts.
One of the problems with the AIDS crisis in the district is that it has often been an invisible crisis. Many people have refused to even deal with the issue of AIDS, even those who are personally involved, thinking that maybe if they don't deal with it, it will disappear. What's being done to bring this crisis out in the open?
Well, I mentioned earlier, for example, that what we've got is the sudden mushroom response from organizations across the city. We've got new organizations coming into being all the time. One of the exciting things that's happening with Whitman-Walker Clinic is that most of these organizations recognize the years of experience through commitment and delivery of services that the clinic has gained. And so organizations are beginning to come to the clinic and ask for their assistance as they develop specific kinds of programs geared towards specific communities. And I think that that's going to help. I had a very encouraging meeting with a black minister last week, and one of the problems has been that the black church in Washington, D.C. has, for years now, just refused to talk about the issue of AIDS. Finally, we've got some very influential, progressive black ministers that are willing to get out there on the line and try and exchange information with other ministers, pass the information on in their congregations, of course within the confines of their own religious doctrines.
Great.
But at the same time, something's happening. Okay. And I think that what all we can do at this point really is work very aggressively at getting the word out in the community and encouraging the kinds of things that are beginning to happen.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jeff, Jim, and Barrett for joining me. We will now turn to Roger Doughty, President of the Gay and Lesbian Activist Alliance, for his concluding comments.
Thank you, Lorri. We've talked about 4 issues in our brief program tonight: home rule, funding for AIDS, the right to privacy, and the accountability of our elected officials. There's a common thread that runs through all of these issues, and it's very simple: the demand for equal protection under the law by lesbians and gay men in the District of Columbia. As self-respecting citizens of this city, we claim as our basic right this equality. We claim it first as human beings and citizens, and second, as hardworking taxpayers who take pride in our homes, nurture our families, care for our sick, and contribute just as much to this city as any other group of people. And this equal protection under the law means some specific things. It means that the sodomy laws in the District of Columbia need to be repealed immediately. It means that funding for AIDS, a disease which cuts across all groups of people in this city, needs to be increased just as the caseload goes up. And most importantly, it means that the Human Rights Act needs to be preserved and upheld. We must not allow Congress or any other person or group to change our resolve, to weaken our will to preserve the basic human and civil rights of all citizens in the district. And when, as happened last December, our elected officials waver in that support and they don't stand up for our rights, we will hold them accountable. We're not going to be treated as scapegoats, and we won't be treated like second-class citizens. In fact, instead of dividing ourselves, whether that's as black and white, rich and poor, or gay and straight, we all need to come together to become equal partners in our common struggle for home rule and for statehood for D.C. All of us, regardless of our age, our religion, race, gender, sexual orientation, physical disability, or how much money we make, need to work together to win equality for the people of this city, for ourselves. The threat to home rule isn't over by any means. It seems like every day recently, voices are raised on Capitol Hill wanting to take away some part of our rights to govern ourselves. Sure, D.C. has problems, as does every city. But what we need is to be given the power and the authority and given the support that we need in order to fix those problems, not to have somebody take that authority away from us so that we can handle them ourselves. It's going to be a long, hard fight, and it's a fight we're going to win only if we're all able to stand together, united in our single demand that we be allowed to govern ourselves. Thank you very much for watching tonight.
met my brother the other day. I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he scandalized my name. Now do you call that a brother? No, no. You call that a brother? No, no. Call that a brother? No, no. Scandalize my name. I met my sister the other day. I gave her my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, she too scandalized my name. Now do you call that a sister? No, no. You call that a sister? No, no. Call that a sister? No, no. Scandalize my name. I met my preacher the other day. I gave him my right hand, and just as soon as ever my back was turned, he too scandalized my name. Now do you call that religion? No, no. You call